Greetings and salutations, dear viewer, and welcome to another episode of the Politics of Discretion podcast. Today, we're going to talk about, yes, you guessed it, tariffs. If you're not bored to death already with this subject, well, then I'm going to make sure that you are by the time we're done here. But we're going to talk about a slightly different aspect of this action, and this is the national security rationale that is being used to levy the tariffs against imported steel and aluminum. Now, in typical Trumpian fashion, this is a proposal that was put out there sort of in the spur of the moment and then walked back, and ever since then we've had conflicting reports about, are they going to be levied against all nations? Are we going to accept nations that are actually our trading partners and instead punish countries like China, who we're accusing of dumping steel and thus undermining national security? The details are sketchy at best. Supposedly at 3:30 today, we're going to find out exactly what's going on. But what we do know for sure is that President Trump is using the rationale that the importation of foreign steel is a threat to our national security. This is true both in an economic sense and in a military sense, because we don't necessarily want to trust foreign steel when we're doing things like building battleships, so we want to be able to have a good supply of domestic steel that we know we can rely on the quality of, and also we want to make sure that we have strong industries that are growing America domestically. Now, in general, anytime national security is talked about politically, this is less of a emphasis on the domestic side of politics and more focused on international affairs. So the fact that this is being justified under a national security rationale, and one that adopts language used in the 1960s under the Tariff Expansion Act, under the Trade Expansion Act, is interesting of itself. And so it's worth going back and looking at what the actual language is, because we have to remember that this is the early 1960s. We're not living in the same trade environment and the same global market environment, and we have the world divided between sort of the free world and the communist world, and there are very real and exigent fears about the threat of global communism and how, through economic competition and the rise of the Soviet Union and the nations that it supports and their ability to sort of rise to the forefront of the world stage, that might have an impact on the U.S. and other countries domestically, and that this was actually a very real threat to national security. Clearly, this is no longer a situation that we're dealing with, so the fact that the national security portion of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which is not what is usually cited when presidents want to levy tariffs, is interesting of itself. So it's worth going back and looking at exactly what this act is and exactly what the national security rationale under it means. Right? So, as I said, Trade Expansion Act signed in 1962 by President JFK. And the purpose of the bill, which is stated in the very beginning, is to promote the general welfare, foreign policy, and security of the United States through international trade agreements and through adjustment assistance to domestic industry, agriculture, and labor. Okay, so already we see a different emphasis from that which Trump is currently relying on. And this is the idea that we want to foster international trade with countries who have mutual interest to the United States. Again, remember, this is the context of the specter of global communism. But this isn't a blanket tariff that impacts both friendly countries and enemy countries. This is the idea that in order to mitigate the threat of global communism, to push Russia to the outskirts of the international order, we should, instead of continuing to trade with hostile countries and friendly countries and penalize those nations who pursue unamenable policies, which is generally what happens under a tariff, right? We're just making goods more expensive. We're not ceasing to trade with someone who we don't agree with. Instead, what the Trade Expansion Act says is let's promote growth with amenable countries to our mutual benefit, and this will incentivize trade with nations who share values, and thus buoy their world standing and stimulate greater economic prosperity at the same time. And in doing so, because it's placing nations who have similar values on a greater forefront of the world stage and is making them a greater emphasis of economic trade on a global scale, it means that hostile nations like the USSR are pushed sort of to the outskirts of the international order. It's harder for them to pursue trade and to have influence because we're offering a better deal for countries who we fundamentally agree with. So already there's a difference there. Now, the section that President Trump is citing is Section 232, which is entitled Safeguarding National Security. And there are a couple of sections to this. The first, Section A, just says that tariffs under the 1930 Act, which is what this act is amending, shouldn't be decreased or eliminated if the president determines that they might be a threat to national security. So if there's an existing tariff and someone wants to do away with it, the president can say, well, if we do that, then that's a threat to global security, so we're going to leave the tariff as it is. Section B is outlines a process by which the director of the Office of Emergency Management brings the issue of imported goods that could conceivably be a threat to domestic security to the attention of the president. And if the president, with the information provided to him by the director of the Office of Emergency Management, and the director of the Office of Emergency Management is supposed to consult directors and other agencies and gather actual evidence to present to the president, and if the president finds the case to be compelling, he will then adjust tariffs accordingly. Okay, so there's an actual executive process going on here. This isn't the president just going off in the heat of the moment. And then we get to Section C, where there's an actual definition of national security in the context of this bill. And as this is what the president is citing, this is really important. So we're just going to read a portion of the actual bill. And it reads, "The director and the president shall further recognize the close relation of the economic welfare of the nation to our national security, and on the economic welfare of individual domestic industries, and any substantial unemployment, decrease in revenues of government, loss of skills or investment, or other serious effects resulting from the displacement of any domestic products by excessive imports shall be considered without excluding other factors, and determine whether such weakening of our internal economy may impair national security." And then Section D is the concluding section, and this just deals with the issuance of relevant reports to everything in Sections A, B, and C. So the takeaway really from Section C is that this bill is not a sanction for unilateral executive power. The president can't just go off half-cocked and levy tariffs because he personally thinks it's a good idea and thinks that some industry is under threat. There's an actual process here. We levy tariffs based on demonstrative evidence drawn from a number of executive departments. And there's a really serious attention to cost-benefit analysis. Section C talks about other factors. So the question is whether the action might do more harm than good. There might be the perception that some import is doing some mitigating damage to the economy, but to get rid of it might do more harm than good, and so that should also be a relevant factor in considering whether or not tariffs should be levied. And again, all this is done within a framework that includes input from other executive officials. And particularly the economic element of this is not quite so broad and platitudinous as the language in which President Trump is now talking about when he's talking about just broadly putting high tariffs on all imported steel and aluminum. The text references individual domestic industries, so there's careful attention to really specific things, right? It's not just steel, which is a commodity. It's steel in the automotive industry, steel in the construction industry, steel in manufacturing industry. So there's careful attention to how these sweeping executive powers might impact the different industries that make up the American economy. So there's really a greater attention to microeconomics, which is totally missing from the current debate that we're having. And the phrase harm done by excessive imports is also important too, because it's not just about imports in general, it's about levels and about trade balances, and again, just much more careful attention to the actual on the ground details of trade within specific industries. It's not just a blanket, foreign steel is bad, we need to exclude it, and then domestic steel will be bolstered, right? There's a recognition that economics, particularly when you're talking about a national economy, which is, there's no such thing as a national economy. The national economy is simply the collective entity of when you take each individual industry in the nation and consider them all put together in one group. That doesn't change the fact that there are many different industries and they all contribute to the whole of the national economy in different ways. And this is something that's missing from the current debate that we're having. Now, there are still plenty of reasons to object to the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. There's still a great deal of executive discretion and executive latitude at play here, and it does alter Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to impose duties. Tariffs are duties. So again, we are eroding the balance of powers and changing the constitutional order. But there is, at least in this bill as originally drafted, a greater sense that there needs to be a careful, scrutinizing, deliberative process in sweeping executive action like this. There is more of an awareness that when presidents take executive action that impacts the entire nation, there is great potential to do harm. There is great potential for things to go awry, and therefore these are things that should be very carefully considered before they're enacted. And this is missing from the way that Trump has announced these tariffs, and the idea that it came totally out of the blue. Not even his closest advisors in the White House knew that this was coming. There was no economic study done beforehand to gauge what the impact of this might be, right? This economic study would be in line with Section 232 and the processes that it outlines. There were no policy papers that were drafted. The administration had nothing prepared. And indeed, there was, by all reports, even not any consensus as to exactly how high the tariffs would be. It appears to be a number that the president simply pulled out of thin air, and we don't actually even know what that number is going to be yet, and we won't know until the official announcement is made. So there's a sense in the original bill that a full-blown trade war might be among the other factors that make pursuing tariffs a bad idea. This is ultimately still an act that recognizes that free trade is a good thing as compared to the president and his multiple, it needs to be not just free trade, but fair trade. It needs to be smart trade, all these qualifiers that we've put on there. And if you want something truly incredible, the signing statement, well, actually, it's not a signing statement, it's the remarks that JFK gave when he signed this bill, are they're pretty astounding in the context of the argument that's now being made on the basis of Section 232 of this bill. As I was doing research on this and really looking to figure out exactly what the term national security meant in this context, because it can change from bill to bill, I came across the statement made by JFK, and my mouth hung open for a while. So this is, and I fully recommend you going and reading the full thing. I'll post the link to it in the description of this video, but just this passage is truly incredible. So JFK said, "This act recognizes fully and completely that we cannot protect our economy by stagnating behind tariff walls, but that the best protection possible is a mutual lowering of tariff barriers among friendly nations so that all may benefit from a free flow of goods. Increased economic activity resulting from increased trade will provide more job opportunities for our workers. Our industry, our agriculture, our mining will benefit from increased export opportunities as other nations agree to lower their tariffs. Increased exports and imports will benefit our ports, steamship lines, and airlines as they handle an increased amount of trade. Lowering of our tariffs will provide an increased flow of goods for our American consumers. Our industries will be stimulated by increased export opportunities and by freer competition with the industries of other nations for an even greater effort to develop an efficient, economic, and productive system. This result can bring a dynamic new era of growth." All right, so that phrase, mutual lowering of tariff barriers among friendly nations so that all may benefit from a free flow of goods. This is exactly the opposite of what this bill is currently being used to promote. So in effect, we have JFK speaking from beyond the grave to debunk Trump's protectionist rationale in a statement that turns on its head the very bill that Trump is citing as a way to enforce his policy. How is that for metaphysical? Right, but the emphasis that JFK is placing on this bill is not isolation or protectionism, but it's really all about value. And the emphasis is on don't trade with nations if your values don't align. You effectively ignore bad partners like the Soviet Union, who promoted ideas fundamentally at odds with individual that we believed were fundamentally degrading to individual self-sovereignty and to cultures of freedom. And so we decided not to trade with them. And we didn't just slap a tariff on goods that the Soviet Union was exporting and still continue to trade with them and to trade with everyone else, and thus effectively punish other nations who we didn't have an issue with. Instead, you ignore that bad partner, you don't trade with Russia, and you create an incentive that says to the rest of the world, don't trade with Russia either. See, we have values in common, and let's build ourselves up by creating a economic environment that's freer, that lowers tariffs so that there's a greater exchange of goods, which works to our mutual benefit. And then you punish bad actors through exclusion. They're pushed to the outside, and those whose values you do support are buoyed up. You trade with them, everyone benefits, and effectively you create a scenario where the Soviet Union, if it wants to survive, has to bring itself around to amenable values. Otherwise, it's going to be excluded and essentially exist in a mercantilist state, which means that its economy will degrade and die over time. And the argument that is being used in part to rationalize these tariffs is that China is dumping steel and that this is unfair to American producers, it's unfair to other free nations who produce steel, and it's a danger to our national security, not only because it creates unfair competition for American steel production, but it is potentially dangerous if we end up using Chinese steel in our military weaponry, and this could create a scenario where China effectively gives us bad steel and this hampers our military ability. All right, but the answer to this is creating a culture, just as JFK was promoting, not where we continue to trade with China, but instead just slap a tariff on it and hope that eventually they will change their ways. Instead, what we do is to cease trading with China and turn to other nations like Canada. We receive roughly 20% of our imported steel from Canada. So turn to Canada and say, let's enter into a mutually beneficial trade pact. Let's lower barriers between our nation and try to foster trade and grow our domestic industries at the same time. And this means that you're creating a culture where, the United States and China then are buoyed up to the forefront of the steel industry, and that means that maybe other European nations, because they see that this better deal is on offer, will abandon China and will instead trade with the West. This is the culture that we're promoting versus a blanket tariff, which it might hurt China, but it's going to hurt our trading partners like Canada more, even though they haven't done anything that we should be punishing them for. And instead, you enter a escalating trade war where everyone slaps protectionist tariffs on imported goods in response to the nation that initially slapped the tariffs on. So everyone's circling the wagons, which is effectively buoying China because they're the only ones who aren't affected by this, and they can instead continue their practices, and because they're still offering the cheaper option, nations are still going to trade with them. So this has exactly the opposite effect that we want it to have on a international scale, not to mention the national effects that it has, which create effectively taxes on consumers, which drive up the cost of doing business, and which strain relations with foreign nations. And the difference between the approach of JFK and the approach of Donald Trump is really attention to principle. And this is lacking from Trump's approach. What he's essentially doing is a very populist move, which is instinctual pandering to fears, and it's why ideology shouldn't be exercised from government. In the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, and particularly in the comments that JFK made that accompany it, we can see a very clear free market ideology, and we can see a rationale that develops behind the principles. The principle is free trade is good. Free trade benefits us domestically, and free trade can be then directed so that we are promoting certain foundational values. And we do that by trading with others who we perceive to have the same values, and by fostering a relationship with them and buoying them up and effectively edging out anyone we disagree with. This is a very different approach to government than is the reactionism of Trump, which is much more chaotic, which is much more simply, this is a behavior we don't like, so we're going to push it away and punish it, but not actually going to take any proactive action ourselves. Right? If the United States actually thinks that China is a threat, then it shouldn't be trading with China. It shouldn't simply say, well, we're going to continue to trade with China, but we're going to make it slightly more expensive for you because we don't like your policies. All right, so there's the big fundamental difference there. Now, another issue that is implicit in this is the sort of mission creep that can occur in legislation. Right, so we've seen that the bill that Donald Trump is citing as a rationale to implement his tariffs was pretty clearly meant to have almost the exact opposite effect on the US's trading behaviors. And the fact that it can be so eroded and warped over time is really a pretty compelling case for sunsets, for the idea that bills should expire after a certain period of time. Because if you think about it, it is pretty ridiculous to cite a 1962 bill where national security is defined with reference to the threat of global communism and international politics and international economy, which is based around the division of the world into the free world and the specter of communism, and industry is different, production is different. You don't even have much of the technological and computer-oriented industries that we have today. So it's a vastly different world. So it's fairly ridiculous that we're citing rationales from a completely bygone era and thinking that we can just then modernize them and use them in the context of today. You can do that with values. The free trade values that JFK is espousing are still relevant today and are still good policy. And we have an entire history of the negative effects of tariffs, which demonstrate to us over the course of American history and over the course of economic conditions that shift with the times and with burgeoning technology and the growth of the United States and different international eras, that even though all of those conditions change, free market values still work, because when we apply the opposite, when we apply tariffs, it's generally followed by economic disaster and downturn at home. Right, so values stay constant, but political rationales do not. And this is why we should have limitations upon law and limitations upon the president. Because the ability for the president to so turn this law on its head is not just about the language of the 1960s, it's also about executive overreach and about a president who is so unmoored from any sort of idea of rule of law that he can just, on a whim, say, we're going to implement this policy, and people in his administration say, wait, hold on a minute, we're not ready for this. And he says, well, I don't care. And economic experts and political experts and say, let's hold on and think about this for a minute. And he says, no, I don't want to. And there's not a whole lot that we can do about that, right? Even if Congress was to introduce legislation to take back their power under Article 1 to impose duties, that's still got to go through the executive branch, right? Legislation has to be signed by the president. So you would need a supermajority in Congress just for Congress to be able to take back the power that they've ceded. Which is really backwards, because this places limitations on Congress at the same time that the executive has sort of become unmoored. And this, again, is a really solid argument for just making sure that rule of law is something that is really closely scrutinized and managed, just like the process for tariffs that's actually set up in the 1962 bill. There's this careful attention to detail, this careful weighing of positives and negatives, this careful attention to what are the long-term effects. And that's missing from politics right now. But if we create a situation where, let's say every 20 years or so, things come up for reauthorization, then we introduce a way of doing things where you have to apply that scrutiny. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with a totally chaotic and unordered system. All right, so that's all for us for today. Happy musing, dear viewers.